There is a text nearly 2,500 years old that describes, in unsettling detail, how 200 celestial beings descended upon Mount Hermon, made a pact, took human wives, and fathered a lineage of giants that corrupted the entire earth. This text is not a vague oral legend. It contains proper names, geographical locations, genealogies, and even chapter and verse numbers. It was read, copied, and cited by early Jewish and Christian communities as legitimate scripture. And then, sometime between the 3rd and 4th centuries, someone decided it should no longer be in the Bible. The question is not whether the Book of Enoch existed. It is right there, preserved in Ethiopic, with Aramaic fragments found at Qumran and explicitly cited in the Epistle of Jude. The question is, why was a text so influential, so detailed, and so connected to Genesis 6 systematically removed from the Christian canon while remaining sacred scripture in Ethiopia to this day? If the answer were simple heresy, why did the Church Fathers debate it so extensively before banning it? And if it was so dangerous, why did the Essenes of Qumran keep multiple copies of it alongside the scrolls of Isaiah and the Psalms? If you want to understand why certain texts shape the faith of billions while others disappear, even when they contain information that completely changes the reading of canonical passages, subscribe now. This channel investigates exactly that, the archaeology of what was said, what was silenced, and what never stopped echoing on the margins. Today, you will learn 3 things. First, what the Book of Enoch actually says about the Nephilim and the Watchers, word for word, without a devotional filter. Second, why it was accepted as scripture by Second Temple Jews and early Christians, and what changed. Third, the difference between reading this narrative as a moral allegory, as a corrupted historical memory, or as a literal record of events that would require rewriting the accepted chronology of human origins. We aren't going to solve the mystery. We are going to map out why it is a mystery. Why a text that explains Genesis 6 so directly was considered too much explanation. The backbone of all this lies in Genesis 6, verses 1 to 4. The Hebrew text is brutally economical. When men began to multiply on the face of the ground and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were fair, and they took to wife such of them as they chose. Then comes the line that never quite added up. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men that were of old, the men of renown. 4 verses. No context. No explanation of who the sons of God are, why this produced giants, or what happened to those giants. The narrative simply jumps straight to God deciding to send the flood because the wickedness of man was great in the earth. Cause and effect remain implicit rather than explicit. For centuries, this generated 2 rival readings. The first, proposed by some rabbis of the Talmudic period, and later adopted by most church fathers. 9 sons of God refers to the descendants of Seth, the pious lineage of Adam, who married the daughters of men, the descendants of Cain, the corrupt lineage. The issue is a moral metaphor, not a biological one. The crossing of righteous lineages with sinful ones leads to spiritual degradation. In this reading, Nephilim becomes a synonym for tyrants or violent men, not necessarily physical giants. It is a safe reading that creates no cosmological problems and keeps the narrative within the framework of human moral choice and proportional divine punishment. The second reading is older and was the majority view in Second Temple Judaism. Sons of God is the technical term used in the book of Job for angels or celestial beings who present themselves before God. In Job chapter 1, 6, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. Same expression, same grammar. If it means angels in Job, why would it mean humans in Genesis? In this reading, the text is saying exactly what it seems to be saying. Rebel angels descended, mated with human women, and the biological result was a hybrid race of abnormal dimensions and disproportionate power. The Nephilim are not a metaphor. They are the product of a transgression that violates the ontological categories created by God. And this, not common human violence, is the trigger for the flood. It wasn't just a moral punishment, but an existential cleanup operation. The Book of Enoch was written to be the explanation that Genesis 6 did not provide. It takes those 4 verses and expands them into a full narrative complete with chronology, motivation, the names of the angels involved, a description of the giants, and even the final judgment of those angels. It is impossible to read Enoch and then read Genesis 6 as a metaphor. The text doesn't allow it. Enoch chapter 6 begins, "And it came to pass, when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of the heaven, saw and lusted after them." There is no ambiguity. Angels is explicit. The narrative continues. "And Semyaza, who was their leader, said unto them, I fear you will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin. And they all answered him and said, Let us all swear an oath, and all bind ourselves by mutual imprecations, not to abandon this plan, but to do this thing. 200 angels, a binding pact, a descent upon Mount Hermon. Hermon, that in Hebrew, comes from the root meaning pact or anathema. The text is not using symbolic geography. It is saying it happened there. Enoch chapter 7 describes what happened next. And they became pregnant, and they bare large giants, whose height was 3,000 ells. 3,000 ells, cubits. If the standard cubit of the ancient Near East was about 45 centimeters, that equals 350 meters. This number is obviously problematic. Later copyists corrected it to 300 cubits, which is still 135 meters, taller than the Great Pyramid. While the Ethiopic translation preserves 3,000, there is a consensus among scholars that textual corruption occurred there. The point isn't numerical precision, it's the order of magnitude. The text wants to communicate that these beings were far too large for the normal human scale. The narrative continues, who consumed all the acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. A logistical collapse, predation, a breakdown of the food chain, but it wasn't just physical violence. Enoch chapter 8 introduces what the Watchers taught humans. Azazel taught men to make swords, knives, shields, breastplates, and how to work metals. He taught women the art of cosmetics, jewelry, and dyes. Semyaza taught enchantments and root cutting. Armaros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakal taught astrology. Kokabil taught the constellations. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of the clouds. Arakiel, the signs of the earth. Shamsiel, the signs of the sun. Sariel taught the course of the moon. This isn't just technology, it is operational cosmology. It is knowledge out of sequence. Humanity receives tools of power before having the moral maturity or social infrastructure to contain them. The result, according to the text, is that there arose much godlessness, and they committed fornication, and they were led astray, and became corrupt in all their ways. If you read Enoch as allegorical fiction invented by a 3rd century BC scribe trying to explain the evil in the world, the text works. It is a parable about forbidden knowledge, the transgression of boundaries, and the corruption of natural orders. The angels represent temptation. The giants represent the fruit of hubris. The violence and environmental degradation represent the consequences of seeking power without wisdom. This is a valid reading. The problem is that this was not the reading of the communities that preserved the text. For the Essenes of Qumran, Enoch was history. At least 11 different manuscripts of Enoch were found in the caves, more copies than of many books that are in the Hebrew canon. They weren't copying a parable, they were copying a record. Josephus, the 1st century Jewish historian, mentions that the Essenes had books of the ancients and speaks of Essene predictions involving angels and future judgments. Philo of Alexandria, a contemporary of Christ, alludes to the account of giants as real events, not metaphor. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament made by Alexandrian Jews between the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, translates Nephilim in Genesis 6 as giants, not tyrants. Translation is interpretation. They read it literally. The Epistle of Jude is the critical turning point. Jude, the half-brother of Jesus, according to tradition, writes a brief letter included in the New Testament. In verse 14, he explicitly cites Enoch. Enoch, the 7th from Adam, prophesied of these, saying, Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints to execute judgment upon all. This quotation comes from Enoch chapter 1, verses 9 and 10. Jude calls Enoch a prophet. He uses the text of Enoch with the same authority he would use to cite Isaiah or Jeremiah. And in verse 6, he makes an even more direct reference. And the angels, which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness, unto the judgment of the great day. Now, this is Enoch chapter 10, almost word for word. Jude isn't making a casual reference. He is building his theology of apostasy upon the narrative of Enoch. If Enoch is fiction, Jude is building doctrine on fiction. If Enoch is a record, Jude is validating that record. Clement of Alexandria, a 2nd century church father, cites Enoch and treats it as prophetic. Tertullian, in the early 3rd century, openly defends the authenticity of Enoch, arguing it should be considered scripture because it was preserved on the ark by Noah and because Jude cites it. Origen, another giant of early Christian theology, references Enoch in his discussions on fallen angels. Athenagoras, a 2nd century apologist, uses the Enoch narrative to explain the origin of demons. Demons are the spirits of the giants killed in the flood. Having no bodies, they wander the earth trying to possess humans. This interpretation became established doctrine in various early Christian circles. It wasn't fringe, it was early mainstream. And then something changes. In the 4th century, Jerome excludes Enoch while compiling the Latin Vulgate. Augustine, though mentioning the text, argues it should not be included in the canon because its antiquity cannot be verified, and because it was not preserved by the Jews in the official Hebrew canon established at Jamnia at the end of the 1st century. Augustine's argument is procedural, not theological. He doesn't say Enoch teaches falsehood. He says that because the Jewish canonization process rejected it, the church should follow that precedent. But here's the tension. The Jews at Jamnia were reconstructing Judaism after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. They needed a portable, defensible canon focused on texts that reinforced national identity and law. Enoch is apocalyptic, cosmological, and full of complex angelology. It didn't serve the project of Jamnia. But that doesn't mean Second Temple Jews before the destruction didn't consider it scripture. They did, and the Qumran copies prove it. So why did the church follow Jamnia instead of Qumran? Part of the answer is ecclesiastical politics. In the 4th century, Christianity was becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire. Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. The church needed doctrinal unity, a closed canon, and well-defined heresies to combat. Texts that generated multiple possible readings, opened questions about the nature of angels, or suggested that spiritual beings could interfere biologically with creation were problematic. They opened doors that orthodoxy was trying to close. If angels could mate with humans, what did that imply about the nature of Christ? If Christ is God incarnate, is he a case of a son of God mating with a human like the Watchers? Obviously not, but Enoch's language created dangerous ambiguity. It was better to remove the ambiguity. Another part of the answer is that allegorical reading began to seem safer. Origen had already developed a sophisticated allegorical hermeneutic, reading much of the Old Testament as spiritual typology. Augustine took this further. For Augustine, the sons of God in Genesis 6 were clearly descendants of Seth. Reading literally, angels mating with humans raised questions about the nature of angels that contradicted the established doctrine that angels are purely spiritual and have no permanent physical bodies. If angels have no bodies, how can they reproduce? The obvious answer would be that they assumed bodies, but that makes angelic ontology unstable, creating a category of being that can switch between spirit and matter at will. That sounds like Gnosticism, not orthodoxy. So the solution was to deny that sons of God meant angels, even if Job used the term for angels, even if Jude cited Enoch, and even if the literal reading was the majority view in Second Temple Judaism. In the 5th century, Pope Innocent of Rios and regional African councils began formalizing the Old Testament canon following the Hebrew version rather than the Greek Septuagint. Enoch was left out. At the Council of Trent in the 16th century, the Catholic Church reaffirmed the closed canon. Enoch was not in it. Protestant churches, following the principle of sola scriptura, adopted an even more restricted canon, excluding even books like Tobit and Maccabees that Catholics had kept. Enoch never stood a chance, except in one place, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. To them, Enoch has always been scripture. They preserved it in Ge'ez, the Ethiopian liturgical language, and read it to this day. When James Bruce, a Scottish explorer, returned from Ethiopia in 1773 with 3 copies of Enoch, it was the first time modern European scholars could read the full text. Before that, in the West, Enoch was just fragments cited by church fathers and rumors. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 changed everything. Suddenly, we had Aramaic fragments of Enoch dated between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century AD. This was material confirmation that the text is pre-Christian, confirmation that Second Temple Jewish communities copied and preserved it alongside canonical texts, confirmation that the Ethiopic version, though later, was translating a legitimate Semitic original. And the Qumran fragments include sections describing the Watchers, the Giants, and divine judgment. They aren't Christian interpolations or medieval legends. They are Jewish texts from the period when Genesis 6 was being read and interpreted by the communities that would eventually produce Christianity. So the real question isn't, why did the Vatican ban Enoch? The question is, what were they protecting by banning it? If you read Enoch as allegory, you can integrate it as interesting wisdom literature. If you read Enoch as a historical record, you have to explain Genesis 6 in a way that creates cosmological problems. Angels can violate the created order. Angels can generate biological hybrids. These hybrids must be exterminated by God because they represent an ontological category that is corrupt, not just morally, but existentially. The flood isn't about punishing common human sin. It's about resetting a creation that was contaminated at a genetic and spiritual level. This reading transforms the entire Old Testament into a cosmic war between maintained created orders and violated created orders. It isn't simple theology. It isn't pastoral, and therefore it isn't controllable. But if Enoch is just allegory written centuries later by a creative scribe, why did the Essenes treat it as prophecy? Why does Jude cite it as an authority? Why does Jesus, in Matthew 24, when speaking of the days of Noah returning, use language that echoes Enoch? For, as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark. It may not look like a direct reference, but read Enoch chapter 54. In those days the angels shall descend into the hidden places, and gather together in one place all those who assisted sin. Jesus was speaking to a Jewish audience that knew Enoch. They caught the reference. Other evidence complicating a purely allegorical reading is found in the archaeology of narratives. Stories of giants are not exclusive to Enoch or the Hebrew Bible. They appear in Gilgamesh, where Humbaba, the guardian of the cedar forest, is described as having superhuman dimensions and strength. They appear in Greek mythology with the Titans and the Greek Nephilim, the giants who made war on the Olympian gods. They appear in Sumerian legends about the Anunnaki, beings who descended from the heavens and instructed humans in advanced knowledge. They appear in Native American traditions about man-eaters of great stature who dominated certain regions before being exterminated. They appear in Polynesian accounts of ancestors of abnormal stature. If all these traditions are independent, then the theme of giants and celestial beings who interfere with humans is a universal psychological archetype, something that arises naturally when primitive cultures try to explain ancient ruins or megafauna remains. That is the standard anthropological explanation. The problem is that some of these traditions have structural parallels too specific to be total coincidence. Gilgamesh doesn't just talk about giants. The Atrahasis tablet, a Sumero-Akkadian text, describes lesser gods, the Igigi, who rebelled against the forced labor of maintaining creation. The greater gods, the Anunnaki, decided to create humans to do the work in place of the Igigi, but then humans multiplied too much and made too much noise, so the gods decided to send a flood to exterminate them. A righteous human, Atrahasis, is warned by a benevolent god and builds a boat, saving his family and animals. The flood resets humanity. This isn't just a global flood story, it's the same sequence. Celestial rebellion, the creation of a problematic category of beings, a divine decision for extermination via flood, and a righteous survivor warned beforehand. The differences are obvious. In the Sumerian account, humans themselves are the problem, not hybrids, but the narrative structure is too parallel to ignore. One hypothesis is that all these myths derive from a fragmented cultural memory of a real catastrophic flood event in Mesopotamia. The plain between the Tigris and Euphrates floods devastatingly when exceptional rains combine with snowmelt from northern mountains. Archaeologists have found layers of alluvial sediment at sites like Ur and Shuruppak, dating to around 2900 BC, consistent with a massive regional flood. For the populations living there, a flood covering the entire habitable region would be indistinguishable from a global flood. The memory would be passed down, gain theological layers, and each culture would reinterpret it within its own religious system. The Hebrews, heirs to the Mesopotamian tradition via Abraham coming from Ur, would adapt the Atrahasis myth into Noah, but add the narrative of the Watchers and Nephilim to explain why God sent the flood. It wasn't just divine population control, it was the corruption of creation by angelic transgression. But if the base is a regional flood from 2900 BC, where does the layer about giants and fallen angels come from? One possibility, megalithic ruins. In the Levant, where the text of Enoch was likely composed, there are Bronze Age and even Neolithic structures that would have been ancient and mysterious even to Hebrews of the first millennium BC. Baalbek in Lebanon has stone blocks weighing up to 800 tons. Even with modern techniques, moving blocks of that size is a complex engineering operation. To a culture without hydraulic cranes or an industrial-scale understanding of friction physics, the natural explanation would be, beings much larger and stronger than us built this. Giants became the default explanation for inexplicable monumental architecture. This isn't primitive thinking, it is rational inference based on limited information. The Romans, upon finding fossilized mammoth and mastodon bones, interpreted them as the remains of giants. Hadrian, according to Suetonius, collected bones of giants and displayed them. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, mentions skeletons of gigantic stature found after earthquakes in Crete. Pausanias, a 2nd century AD Greek geographer, describes a giant's skeleton displayed in the city of Temesa. They weren't inventing, they were interpreting the fossils of extinct megafauna as evidence of giant humans. If that was the interpretation in the Greco-Roman world with access to a well-developed naturalist philosophical tradition, imagine Levant communities in the Persian or Hellenistic periods finding the same types of fossils. They had Genesis 6, they had oral traditions about Nephilim. Finding a 3-meter-long femur wouldn't create doubt, it would create confirmation. Look, the giants really did exist. But there's another thread in this story that megalithic and paleontological explanations don't fully resolve. The Hebrew term Nephilim doesn't simply mean giants. The root is naphal, meaning to fall. Nephilim can mean the fallen ones, those who caused to fall, or those who fell upon others. Or the Septuagint translation as gigantes, giants in Greek, may have been an interpretation based on the context of Genesis 6, where Nephilim are described as mighty men and men of renown, suggesting physical stature or power. But the Hebrew root allows for a more sinister reading. Nephilim are the ones who knock down, the invaders, those who fall upon others like predators. This isn't just about size, it's about nature. They are a distinct ontological category that operates in a predatory mode against common humans. Enoch develops this distinction. The giants consume human production until logistical exhaustion. Then they begin to consume humans themselves. Enoch chapter 7, verse 5. The giants began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. This isn't common moral violence. It is a breakdown of the created order. Carnivores shouldn't eat other carnivores, and humans shouldn't eat humans. The angelic human hybridization produced something that does not behave according to the original design. The text continues, "Then the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones." The earth acts as an agent. It isn't humanity complaining to God. It is material creation itself signaling that something is wrong at an ontological level. This echoes Genesis 4, where God says to Cain, "The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground." The earth witnesses. The earth accuses. A violation of the created order registers itself in matter. If you followed this far and are starting to see how these layers connect, text, tradition, archaeology, and linguistics, leave a comment. Do you read the account of the Nephilim as a moral metaphor? As a distorted cultural memory of real events? A mix of both, or something else entirely? No aggressive religious debate, just what convinces you most, and why? Returning to Enoch's narrative. After the giants corrupt the earth and the Watchers teach forbidden knowledge, 4 archangels go up to God with the accusation. Enoch, chapter 9. Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel present the case. You see what Azazel has done, how he has taught all unrighteousness on earth and revealed the eternal secrets which were in heaven. And Semyeza, to whom you have given authority to bear rule over his associates, has taught enchantments. And they have gone to the daughters of men together, slept with them, become defiled, and revealed to them these sins. And the women have borne giants, and the whole earth has thereby been filled with blood and unrighteousness. The accusation is not that humans sinned. It is that the Watchers violated the order, taught things out of time, and produced a category of beings that cannot coexist with regular creation. God responds by ordering the imprisonment of the Watchers and the destruction of the giants. Enoch, chapter 10, is the judgment. God orders Raphael, "Bind Azazel hand and foot, and cast him into the darkness, and make an opening in the desert, which is in Dudael, and cast him therein. And place upon him rough and jagged rocks, and cover him with darkness, and let him abide there forever, and cover his face that he may not see light. And on the day of the great judgment he shall be cast into the fire." Dudael is a geographical location. Interpretations vary, but one tradition identifies it with desert regions east of the Dead Sea. The text is saying, the leader, rebel angel, is imprisoned in a physical location covered with stones, waiting for final judgment. This is not allegory. It is material cosmology. Angels have location. God orders Gabriel, "Proceed against the bastards and the reprobates, and against the children of fornication, and destroy the children of the Watchers from amongst men. Send them one against another, that they may destroy each other in battle, for length of days shall they not have." The giants must destroy themselves in civil war. This happens before the flood. The flood comes later to clean up what remains. And God orders Michael, "Go, bind Semyaza and his associates, who have united themselves with women so as to have defiled themselves with them in all their uncleanness. Bind them fast for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth, till the day of their judgment." 70 generations. If a generation is 40 years, that's 2 800 years. If it's 25 years, 1 750 years. Either way, it is a long but finite period. The Watchers are not destroyed immediately. They are imprisoned until a future judgment, and their children, the giants, are killed, but their spirits remain. Enoch chapter 15. And now, the giants who are produced from the spirits and the flesh shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, and on the earth shall be their dwelling. Evil spirits have proceeded from their bodies, because they are born from men, and from the holy Watchers is their beginning and primal origin. They shall be evil spirits on earth, and evil spirits shall they be called. As for the spirits of heaven, in heaven shall be their dwelling. But as for the spirits of the earth which were born upon the earth, On the earth shall be their dwelling. Here is the origin of early Christian demonology. Demons are not fallen angels. Fallen angels are the watchers, imprisoned until judgment. Demons are the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim killed in the flood. Lacking bodies, they wander the earth trying to possess humans or influence events. This explains why Jesus and the apostles cast out demons that seem to have distinct identities and personalities. It explains why demons recognize Jesus as the Son of God and fear premature judgment. They know the chronology. They know the final judgment of the watchers and themselves is scheduled. Jesus accelerating the timeline would be a problem for them. Mark 5, the Gadarene demoniac. The demons say, "What have I to do with thee, Jesus, thou Son of the Most High God? I adjure thee by God, that thou torment me not." And then they ask to enter the pigs instead of being sent to the abyss. Why do demons prefer pigs over total disembodiment? Because the abyss is the place of imprisonment for the watchers. If Jesus sends them there before their time, they lose agency until the final judgment. Pigs are better. This reading was alive in the Christianity of the first 3 centuries. Justin Martyr in the 2nd century writes explicitly about the angels who corrupted themselves with women and fathered demons. Athenagoras expands on this. Irenaeus of Lyon discusses the fallen angels and the giants. Clement of Alexandria cites Enoch. Tertullian defends Enoch passionately. But then comes the turn of the 4th and 5th centuries. Augustine rejects the literal reading of Genesis 6. Jerome excludes Enoch from the Vulgate. Demonology undergoes a simplification. Demons become merely fallen angels with no distinction. The narrative of the Watchers and Nephilim is pushed to the margins. It becomes folklore, legend, apocrypha. And the Book of Enoch, the text that founded this complex demonology, is treated as curious but not canonical. Why did this simplification happen? One possibility is that Enoch's demonology created pastoral problems. If demons are the spirits of hybrid angel humans, it means there is a category of beings who were born from angelic transgression, but are not technically guilty of their own origin. The giants didn't choose to be born. They are the product of the Watcher's sin. So what happens to them after death? Do they become demons automatically? Do they have free will? Can they be redeemed? Enoch says they are evil spirits by nature, but this creates an ontological category of beings condemned regardless of moral choice. That is angelic Calvinism. And it doesn't fit well with a theodicy that emphasizes free will as the foundation of divine justice. If giants are born evil, there is no justice in their judgment. There is only ontological determinism. Another possibility is more pragmatic. In the 4th century, the church is consolidating as an imperial institution. Constantine legalized Christianity. Theodosius will make it mandatory. The church now needs to function as an ideological state apparatus. This requires doctrinal clarity, rigid hierarchy, and standardized catechesis. Texts that generate multiple possible readings that allow marginal groups to develop alternative cosmologies are dangerous texts. Enoch is full of apocalyptica, of secret revelations given to Enoch during celestial journeys, of esoteric knowledge about the names and functions of specific angels. This is the kind of text Gnostic groups love. They can take Enoch, interpret it as hidden knowledge given to the elect, and build an entire initiatory structure outside of episcopal control. Better to remove the text from the canon, preserving it as historically interesting but not authoritative. Thus, you control the interpretation without needing to totally suppress the circulation. There is also a question of angelic responsibility. If angels can rebel, mate with humans, and corrupt creation, it means angels have much more agency and power than official theology wants to admit. Scholastic doctrine, which develops in the Middle Ages, portrays angels as perfectly obedient servants of God. They may fall once, like Lucifer, but that is a unique, pretemporal event. After creation, angels do not rebel en masse. They do not physically interfere with the created order. They guard, they message, they worship. Enoch says the opposite. 200 angels make a pact, descend together, mate with humans, teach forbidden knowledge, and are only imprisoned after the earth is already corrupted. This suggests that angels have much more autonomy, capacity for organization, and material power than later orthodoxy admits. And if this is true of the Watchers, what prevents other angels from doing similar things in the present? Nothing, except the vigilance of God and loyal archangels. This makes the cosmos unstable. It turns the human into a piece on a chessboard where there are much more powerful players moving out of sight. The church prefers a stable cosmos, God at the top, obedient angels in the middle, humans at the bottom, demons already defeated on the cross, but allowed to act within strict limits as a test of human free will. This is manageable. This is pastoral. You can build sacraments, liturgy, and catechesis on top of this. Enoch messes everything up, so Enoch goes out. But leaving the canon is not the same as leaving the culture. Enoch continues to circulate in apocalyptic Jewish circles. It continues to influence messianic movements. When John the Baptist appears in the desert preaching imminent judgment and talking about the fire and the axe at the root of the trees, his language echoes Enoch. When Jesus talks about the Son of Man coming in the clouds with power and glory, he is using a title that comes from Daniel 7 but has deep resonance with Enoch, where the Son of Man is a celestial figure who judges the kings and mighty of the earth. The Essenes of Qumran, whom many scholars associate with John the Baptist, held Enoch as central scripture. The probability that John and Jesus knew Enoch is extremely high. They grew up in a cultural environment where these texts circulated. Paul, in Ephesians 6, writes, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." Principalities and powers, archi and exousiai. These are the technical Greek terms for levels of angelic hierarchy. Paul is saying that the human conflict is secondary. The primary conflict is against structures of spiritual power that operate in celestial places. This is the language of Enoch. The Watchers were called princes and rulers. They had assigned territories. Azazel ruled the desert. Semyaza had authority over associates. Paul is working within a cosmological framework where evil is not just individual and moral. It is structural and angelic. Peter, in his second epistle, writes, "God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment." This is Enoch chapter 10, almost word for word. Peter does not cite Enoch explicitly as Jude does, but he clearly knows the tradition. And the epistle to the Hebrews, chapter 2, when discussing the superiority of Christ over angels, assumes that angels have a significant level of power and agency. They are not simple messengers. They are powers that govern aspects of creation. Christ must be established as superior to them because otherwise the cosmology doesn't close. So what really happened? 3 main readings are at play. The first, moral allegory. Genesis 6 is talking about the crossing of pious and impious lineages. Enoch is a creative midrashic elaboration that takes this idea and expands it into a full cosmological narrative, using angelic language as a metaphor for temptation, dangerous knowledge, and the gradual corruption of society. The giants represent tyrants and people of great influence who abuse power. Forbidden knowledge represents technology and culture used without wisdom. The flood represents the inevitable collapse of civilizations built on iniquitous foundations. In this reading, the text functions as a theology of history. It is spiritual truth packaged in narrative form. The second reading, fragmented cultural memory. Something happened in the deep past that violated normal expectations of how the world works. It may have been a ruling elite of significantly advanced stature or technology compared to the primitive agricultural populations that encountered them. It may have been contact with a different culture that had metallurgical, astronomical, or engineering knowledge far beyond the local curve. This event was traumatic enough to be remembered through generations, but not understood. The memory was theologized. Much taller and more powerful people who came from the outside becomes giants born of angels. Advanced knowledge we couldn't replicate becomes celestial secrets taught by forbidden beings. Civilizational collapse followed by catastrophic flooding becomes God sending a flood to clean the corruption. In this reading, the historical core exists, but is wrapped in interpretive layers that transform it into mythology. The historian's job is to peel back the layers and try to recover the original event. This approach has precedence. Heinrich Schliemann found Troy because he took the Iliad seriously as a distorted memory of a real war. Arthur Evans found the Minoan civilization because he investigated Greek legends about King Minos and the labyrinth. The legend of the flood in Gilgamesh correlates with real geological evidence of massive flooding in Mesopotamia. So why not apply the same method to Enoch and Genesis 6? The difficulty is that the central event of the narrative, angels mating with humans, has no obvious natural analog. You could say powerful foreign elite, but why would cultural memory specifically use angelic language? One possible answer. Because angel in ancient Hebrew, malach, simply means messenger. It can be a divine messenger or a human emissary. The ambiguity allows the narrative to accommodate both a supernatural reading and a reading of cultural contact with mysterious outsiders. But there is a complication. The Book of Enoch does not use malach for the Watchers. It uses Irin and Kadishin, Aramaic terms that appear in Daniel 4 as Watchers and Holy Ones. These are specific celestial beings with supervisory functions. They are not human, they are not simply messengers, they are a distinct ontological category with delegated authority over aspects of creation. So the foreign elite reading needs to explain why the text insists so much on categorizing these beings as non-human, as having descended from a superior reality, as having taught knowledge that was in the heavens. Unless heavens is a spatial metaphor for beyond the known horizon, but that would be a very poetic use for a text that elsewhere is extremely specific about geography and names. The third reading is the most controversial, literal take. Enoch is describing real events involving truly non-human beings who really interfered with human biology and really taught advanced knowledge. The giants were real hybrids. The flood was a real response to a real ontological corruption. This reading requires accepting that A, intelligent non-human beings with the capacity to manipulate matter and biology exist. B, they interfered with primitive humanity. C, this interference left marks on global cultural memory. And D, the most preserved record of this interference is in Enoch and related traditions. This reading is rejected by mainstream academia because it violates methodological naturalism, the principle that scientific explanations must involve only natural causes. Admitting intervention by intelligent non-human beings is to introduce an untestable variable into the equation. There is no experiment that proves or refutes the existence of angels, so the hypothesis is non-scientific by definition. But here's the tension. If you interviewed an Essene and Qumran in 50 BC and asked, "Do you believe the Book of Enoch describes literal events?" the answer would be yes. If you interviewed Jude, the half-brother of Jesus, he would cite Enoch as a prophet. If you interviewed Tertullian in 200 AD, he would defend the historical authenticity of the text. The literal reading is not a modern invention of fundamentalists. It is the original reading that was gradually replaced by the allegorical reading as Christian orthodoxy consolidated. So, when exactly did the truth change? Or could it be that what changed was not the truth, but the interpretive framework considered acceptable? Here is what we know with reasonable certainty. First, the Book of Enoch is a pre-Christian Jewish text from the Second Temple period. The Qumran fragments date between 200 BC and 50 AD. This is not disputed. Second, significant Jewish communities, including the Essenes, treated Enoch as authoritative scripture. This is also not disputed. Third, the New Testament cites or alludes to Enoch in at least 3 places. Jude explicitly, 2 Peter strongly, and possibly in several passages of Jesus and Paul. Fourth, the church fathers of the first 3 centuries had varying opinions on Enoch, from fully authoritative to interesting but not canonical. Fifth, starting from the 4th century, Western Orthodoxy rejects Enoch from the canon while the Ethiopian Church maintains it. Sixth, the Dead Sea Scrolls confirm the antiquity and authority of the text in at least one significant branch of Second Temple Judaism. All of this is solid evidence. It does not resolve the question of interpretation, but it closes the debate on historical relevance and influence. What we do not know for certain is whether there was a layer of historical events under the Enoch narrative. We do not have giant skeletons with verifiable DNA showing impossible hybridization. We do not have artifacts proving the transfer of advanced technology to primitive cultures by external agents. We do not have archaeological records of a race of beings of great stature that was exterminated in a global flood event around 3000 BC. What we have are parallel narratives in multiple cultures, megalithic structures that defy easy explanation using contemporary technology, and a surprising number of accounts of giants and beings descended from the heavens, in traditions that should not be connected. This is not proof. It is a pattern, and a pattern demands an explanation. The most economical naturalist explanation is that humans, upon encountering ancient ruins, megafauna fossils, or preserving distorted memories of floods and civilizational collapses, generated mythological narratives that converge on archetypal themes. Giants, descending gods, floods, divine judgments. These themes resonate because they touch on universal human fears and longings. Fear of forces larger than us, fear of cosmic punishment, the longing for an explanation of why evil exists, the longing for a narrative of redemption or restoration after catastrophe. Enoch would be one of these narratives, particularly well crafted, preserved because it served useful theological purposes for communities trying to understand suffering and evil in the world. And it would eventually be rejected from the canon because it created more theological problems than it solved. This explanation works. It is elegant. It preserves methodological naturalism. It does not require postulating non-human beings or supernatural events, but it also requires you to treat all the people who took Enoch literally as being mistaken or thinking primitively. Josephus was mistaken. The Essenes were mistaken. Jude was mistaken. Tertullian was mistaken. All of them failed to realize they were reading creative theological fiction as a historical record. And only starting in the 4th century, when more sophisticated readers like Jerome and Augustine applied proper hermeneutics, did the truth emerge. This is possible, but it requires a significant level of chronological arrogance. It requires believing that we, 2,000 years later, understand what the text really means better than the people living in the same cultural matrix that produced it. There is a third option, an intermediate position. Enoch preserves the memory of real events that were theologized beyond recognition. Something happened. We don't know exactly what. It may have been a culturally advanced elite that dominated and then disappeared. It may have been a civilizational collapse followed by a flood that reset human populations in certain regions. It may have been an encounter with something the normal human category didn't adequately cover. This event was remembered, retold, and interpreted within a religious framework that included angels, demons, divine judgment, and future redemption. The Enoch narrative is the result. It is not fiction invented from scratch. It is not a literal record of precise transcription. It is memory processed through theology. And the work of someone interested in historical truth is to try to triangulate between the theological narrative, archaeological evidence, and cultural parallels to infer what the historical core might have been. This is standard historical methodology applied to any ancient text that mixes history and myth. The problem is that Enoch resists this triangulation. There is no obvious historical core. You cannot easily take 200 angels descended upon Mount Hermon and reduce it to foreign elite arrived via trade route, without losing structural elements of the narrative. The binding pact among the 200, the leadership of Semyaza and Azazel, the division of responsibilities over who teaches what, the differentiated judgment, Azazel in the desert, Semyaza and associates under hills, giants' self-destruction before the flood. These details are too specific to be purely allegorical, but too strange to be purely historical. It is almost as if the text is operating in a different register, neither fiction nor history in the modern sense, but something the category of sacred history tried to capture. True events retold from a perspective that includes invisible dimensions of reality. What stands after all this investigation? First, Genesis 6 is ambiguous. Hebrew grammar allows for both the reading of sons of God as descendants of Seth and sons of God as angels. The second reading was the majority view in Second Temple Judaism. Second, the Book of Enoch was written to explain Genesis 6, literally, not allegorically. It was treated as scripture by significant communities for centuries. Third, the rejection of Enoch from the Christian canon was not because the text contained obvious heresy, but because it created pastoral and theological problems that forming orthodoxy did not want to manage. Fourth, early Christian demonology, including the idea of demons as disembodied spirits of dead giants, derives directly from Enoch. Even after Enoch left the canon, this demonology remained. Fifth, there is no incontestable archaeological evidence of literal giants or angelic intervention. But there are global narrative patterns, megalithic structures, and a surprising number of traditions about outsider beings who interfere with humans. What does not stand? The idea that Enoch is simply apocalyptic fiction without any connection to real events or memories, a text that is copied, preserved, and cited as authority for centuries, does not arise out of nowhere. It is responding to something. The idea that the literal reading is a modern invention also does not hold. The literal reading is the ancient reading that was suppressed for institutional reasons, and the idea that the issue is resolved does not hold. If it were resolved, there would be no debate. There would be no academic factions arguing over it. There would be no continued public interest. The mystery remains because the evidence is ambiguous enough to allow for multiple reconstructions, all internally coherent, none decisive. So, did the Vatican ban the Book of Enoch? Technically, it wasn't the Vatican alone. It was a long process involving councils, church fathers, copyists, and theological decisions distributed over centuries. But the result was the same. A text that shaped Second Temple Jewish cosmology and early Christian demonology was systematically excluded from the Western canon. Why? Because it offered explanations that were too complex, too dangerous, too uncontrollable. It suggested that angels have more agency than orthodoxy wanted to admit. It suggested that evil has ontological roots, not just moral ones. It suggested that God had already intervened catastrophically once to reset a corrupted creation, which opened the door to asking if he would do it again. These are legitimate questions, but they are not questions that an institutional church, trying to maintain social and doctrinal order, wants lay people to ask without clerical supervision. The Ethiopian church never had this concern. They kept Enoch. They read it liturgically. For them, the narrative of the Watchers, the giants, and divine judgment is not peripheral, it is central. And they did not collapse into theological chaos because of it. They developed an interpretive tradition that integrates Enoch without problematizing fundamental Christian orthodoxy regarding Christ, salvation, and final judgment. This proves it was possible to keep Enoch in the canon and still be orthodox. The decision to exclude it in the West was a choice, not a necessity. If you've made it this far, you've just gone through an investigation that covered Hebrew, Aramaic, and Ethiopic text, Second Temple archaeology, the history of canon formation, comparative demonology, global mythological parallels, and 3 rival readings of one of the most influential and suppressed narratives of antiquity. If you want more investigations like this, which follow the evidence wherever it leads without selling easy conclusions, subscribe now and hit the bell. Comment on which of the 3 readings you consider most plausible and why. And if you know someone who thinks they already know everything about the Bible but has never heard of Enoch, share this. Because the history of what was silenced is as important as the history of what was preserved. The bottom line is this: historical truth is reconstruction, not revelation. We do not have direct access to events. We only have texts, artifacts, traditions, and the work of trying to put together the puzzle with missing pieces. Enoch is one of those pieces. It does not solve the puzzle, but it shows the puzzle is larger and stranger than the official version admits. And if you ignore Enoch because it was excluded from the canon, you are letting political and institutional decisions of 4th and 5th century councils dictate what you can consider relevant. That is not faith. It is the delegation of curiosity. And curiosity is the only tool we have to cross the abyss between what was said and what actually happened. Next video, we will investigate why the account of the flood in the Hebrew Bible is almost identical to the account of Atrahasis in Mesopotamia, but with a critical difference that changes everything. If you think you already know how the flood worked, get ready. Because the cuneiform evidence will force you to ask questions that no standard biblical commentary answers. Until then,